First question I would find is, what is the difference between indigenous optimism and just being optimism? And our authors say, who are both indigenous anthropologists, that there's optimism as a disposition, like, hey, I'm a glass half full person, I'm an optimistic person, just kind of as my personality. But what indigenous optimism signifies is a distinctive approach to survival, something you have to do or have to have in order to continue, given the conditions into which you have been a part of. What are the conditions? As COVID's going on and people are freaking out, they felt like we had already experienced the end of the world and had emerged on the other side, or the apocalypse has already occurred. So again, it's this idea that for indigenous peoples, it isn't so much something that is in the future. And it's like all of a sudden, it's like, oh my God, all this terrible stuff is happening. In some ways, for these communities, they already went through it and they are still around, or at least they are persistent. And so it's a different kind of optimism than might be just simply a disposition. It's a distinctive approach to survive. They're questioning a couple of terms that get thrown around a lot in the environmental movement or even in the geological sphere. Some people have proposed that we are living in a new age now called the Anthropocene, a time in which human change surpasses all other forms of change. And so for most people, this is a signal that we have to be very careful about what's happening in the world, because the accumulated effects of humans on the environment outweighs all other factors. Now, when the Anthropocene has been proposed, people get into debates about when it started. Did it start in the 1950s with nuclear power and nuclear energy and nuclear bombs and atomic testing? Did it start in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution? Did it start, my favorite year actually, 1610, when the impacts of colonialism were becoming more evident in the Americas? Or did it start as far back as agriculture? Or did it start as far back as humans themselves? Now, I've argued against a few of those interpretations. What our authors argue is in line with what I believe about the Anthropocene, is that they have been living not necessarily the Anthropocene, but the colonial scene. And that is what has determined our times. And it's the bad effects of humans are a manifestation of particular humans lording it over other humans and creating a colonial landscape. And that in contrast to the idea that humans are a bad influence on the world and are bad influence on their ecosystems or tend to destroy ecosystems, as I showed you in that clip from The Matrix, where Agent Smith believes that humans are a virus that just multiplied, that in fact, when it comes to indigenous peoples, they are actually enhancing their ecosystems. They are cultivating certain plants and animals and enhancing the resilience of these ecosystems. So it's a very different perspective, I think, than some anti-human perspectives in the environmentalist movement, which says that all humans should be cleared out from places so that you only have nature there. And it's also a very different perspective from those of us who are only recently experiencing the effects of climate change or pandemics, the idea that these things have already happened. Now, one of the perhaps surprises of today's world is that despite everything that has happened, there are still indigenous groups who are interested in building different kinds of futures. And so maybe even as of 100 years ago, people, anthropologists included, believed that the indigenous groups were all going to be disappearing. They were going to be subsumed under the Western colonial enterprise. It hasn't happened. And so for indigenous groups, they're very interested in restoration and renewal, and in a theme that will come up in a little bit, but I just want to flag it here. Building relationships with their lands, so the land and land back, and the importance of land, and more than human relatives. So we have relationships with human beings and human relatives, which we may know about, but also these more than human relatives. So the animals, plants, spiritual stuff maybe that is in these landscapes are part of the systems of reciprocity and relationship building for many indigenous groups. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about sections in the textbook about hunting and gathering reciprocity, not just among the human beings, but among plants and animals. Both of our authors are indigenous anthropologists, Natasha Maroule and Clint Carroll, and they say that their role is to engage and sometimes facilitate tribal programs while offering our analyses as situated participant observers. So they mentioned the fact that they come from a tradition that has, for a long time within indigenous studies and even in anthropology, talks about decolonizing or trying to get out of colonial mindsets. And they also mentioned something that Willow had talked about and we mentioned in the introduction, is turning from simply studying damage and harm to trying to outline desire-centered research. That is to say, what do people want to do with their lives, and not simply documenting. It's not that the damage isn't important, but that we need to turn from simply documenting harm and damage to desire-centered research, and focusing on they are in a position and they have to be engaged, that they, when you form these relationships, you have relational accountability to the people you are with and studying with and among. One of the cornerstones of this is this of indigenous research is the idea that we are all related. And as I said earlier, this teaching includes human beings, but also extends beyond the human to express relatedness with the land, water, and all life. So again, this idea of being intermeshed and interconnected, not simply in an abstract way. Of course, it is an abstract pronouncement, but in a real relationship way, setting up those kinds of relationships with your land and the life that is in it. They give us two case studies by each of the authors, one of them with Clint Carroll among the Cherokee, and he has a whole website on this, which you can listen to and see things in his podcast, the Cherokee Environmental Leadership Program, which had featured 4 principles that were coming from the Cherokee elders here about how they should educate themselves and the young. As we mentioned, the idea of building a relationship to the land. One of the elders said, "We were always told you come from the land and everything you need comes from the land. It's your fault if you go hungry. It's your fault if you go hungry." The idea is the land has given enough to provide. The land, the plants, and the animals are all in abundance. And so it is your job to set up the relationships that you need. And if something is happening, that's on you. So building a relationship to the land and the plants and the animals. The second principle is to teach by showing or to learn by doing. So many of the participants the elders had actually been relocated to boarding schools, as we did in this country and in Canada and in Australia, relocating indigenous peoples into boarding schools in order to basically try to impose a Western education on them. And they say that they don't that's not their way of teaching things like that. That in fact, when the whole idea of teaching is about showing. And so oftentimes when the elders try to pass knowledge along, they'll say, help me with this task or help me with this. And so it's about demonstration and working together. And then eventually the person can do it on their own. So the idea is not simply teaching as we're doing it right now by instructing, but as a showing or learning together with. In this section, there was also a pretty fascinating idea about how language is used and how if you use language and words in the context, then it creates these pictures in your mind. And I just want to mention it here because a lot of people try to concentrate on preserving indigenous languages, but they don't. It's not about where those languages are. And for many indigenous languages, they can't really be separated from the place that they are in and the plants that they are describing and the animals that they are interacting with, because if you don't have those in front of you, it doesn't make the same kind of sense. Now, I believe that, in fact, many languages are like this, but it's just an illustration that you can't just separate the language from the people and the place and expect that this is going to work just as well if you're relocated to a new environment. The third principle is having communal and spiritual values. The idea, again, of relatedness and that we are all a family, that is what is most permitted. And the fourth principle, which might seem funny given everything that the indigenous communities have experienced, but it's important for this kind of optimism of survival, is having a good time, which is also my principle of education, right? We're all having a good time. So the purpose of this is to do future building using Cherokee perspectives and strategies to, in some ways, learn together, the elders, the anthropologists, the children, in order to think about the future and in a Cherokee way. Our second case comes to us from the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, and they are trying to restore the lake sturgeon into the watershed. There's a picture of one of that going on. It becomes this annual release ceremony where these fish are being raised in a more controlled environment and then they're released into the wild. And the idea is that, as the author says, Natasha, this is a ceremony that gives them hope that the sturgeon are going to be regenerated, despite the fact that the environment is changing, and so they're vulnerable. And so this kid gets very happy releasing the fish, which is always fun. Have a good day, says the little kid. So it's a time of joy and hope together. And what our author says is that this is partially scientific knowledge, partially trying to establish the conditions for renewal, and that takes a lot of biology and science to understand that, but it's also cultural knowledge that is being passed down and transmitted. So, Indigenous optimism, they say at the end, takes stock of colonial past and presence. So again, it's not simply casting aside the damage and harm that has been done. It is trying to understand what is going, but then turns to focus on Indigenous persistence and renewal despite these impositions, and envisions decolonial futures. So taking stock of what has happened before, focusing on persistence and renewal, and then envisioning a different and new future. So basically, don't replicate the colonial mindset, or don't just have a new form of what's already happened. So they say that there's caution and concern going forward. Of course, it's not the conditions of the world, as we've seen, are still often being visited upon these communities differentially, but going for regeneration, restoration, revitalization.